Hey, wealth builders, Simon Dixon here, and welcome to Bitcoin Hard Talk episode 49. And today is another one of our interview series. Today, I'm really happy to bring in a guest who, over the last 10 months, ever since October the 7th, has become what I consider a dear friend online. Somebody that has helped so many people to just try and unpack the incredible complexities of understanding what we are experiencing and what's happening in the Middle East and all the different regions and the geopolitical impact that it has on us in the West. A complete, well-rounded knowledge of both the impact in terms of financial markets, the humanitarian impact, and just direct on-the-ground experience having been in these different war zones and just experience the human catastrophe that we create as humans. And we first met because Elijah was giving commentary and just really helping us understand and unpack what is happening here. Because we often only experience these wars from the perspective of one-sided propaganda. We don't get to hear the other side. And the beauty of X Spaces and social media is that Elon Musk, essentially, one thing he did bring to us is the ability to speak to each other all from around the world. And one of the people that I met was Elijah. We were involved in supporting some of the children that are not receiving humanitarian aid. And there was different corridors and routes in order to try and get food to the children that were, quite frankly, going through starvation. They weren't receiving the aid. One mechanism, and one of the only mechanism for being able to get that money to those in need, was Bitcoin, because of all the financial censorship that happens. And so, I was engaged in a little campaign to try and support some of these initiatives, and Elijah was helping those just really understand what is happening here, and with a particular focus on the situation in Gaza and the West Bank and what's happening in Israel, and as it's escalated further with Lebanon, and now more involvement with Iraq and Syria. And I really wanted to bring Elijah on to just help my audience unpack it, so that we can understand some of the different impacts. Firstly, the financial impacts, and then also, if this escalates too far, some of the humanitarian impacts as this grows further and further, and what's the likelihood of that happening? Because often those that are paying for the wars indirectly through inflation don't realize the human catastrophe that is actually happening with our money. And unfortunately, due to the entrenchment of central banking and the hidden flows of money, the relationship between us and our money has become so obfuscated that we could be funding things and creating catastrophes indirectly that we've got no idea that we are creating. And so with that in mind, I'd like, firstly, Elijah Magnier. Sorry, I'm really very famous for getting hard pronunciation names wrong. I know you as Elijah because I consider you as a friend. Could you give just a little bit of background of your, very briefly, 35 years of the different things you've been involved with? And then what I'd love to do is start with a question which can take us in many different directions. But what is the likelihood of the situation, the catastrophe that's happening in Gaza right now, escalating to a regional war and something greater? So if you could start with a little bit on your background, and then we'll answer that question.
Hello, Simon. It's great to see you. I've started the first assignment in covering the Israeli invasion of Lebanon in 1982. And then I moved to covering the Iraq-Iran war, and then the first Gulf War, the second Gulf War, the war in Sudan, the Darfur War, and then the Yugoslavian War, the former Yugoslavia, mainly in Bosnia and Sarajevo and in other part of Bosnia and Herzegovina. And then I covered different other wars, like the war in Iraq in 2003, the war in Afghanistan, the war in Syria, the war in Libya, and I covered the war in Lebanon again, 2006. And I've been going on and off to Iraq very often. And I went also to Lebanon almost every year until 2 years ago. That was my last trip to Lebanon. And then I have the intention to go very soon. The work I have done is always on the ground. I'm a very old-fashioned. I discovered the internet very recently. It was around 2012, 2013. And this is when I started my first email. And a few months later, I opened the first account on Twitter, and that was in December 2013. And this is when I started to discover the digital world and try to learn very fast to be able to be in connection with the world. When, as an old-fashioned journalist, we used to use telex and then fax, and we used to type on a typewriter. We didn't have computers. We didn't have mobile phone until 1990s, and that was very primitive. So we relied on satellite phone in zone war, and here I am covering the war now in Gaza, but not being in Gaza.
Okay. So let's start with today, right now, where we are in the current present moment. Right now, the world is expecting Iran and its allies, the axis of resistance that are mainly located in Lebanon, in Yemen, in Iraq, in Syria, and in Palestine, West Bank, and Gaza. There is a reaction and a retaliation because Article 51 was invoked in the United Nations. And we seem to have 40,000 US troops, which, from my understanding, is the most troops that have ever been in US troops in the Middle East ever since the Iraqi war, with naval warships coming across to the Middle East. We're meant to be having a ceasefire negotiation. The head of one side, the axis from Gaza's side, the head negotiator has been assassinated when they were meant to be getting close to a deal. The West is saying that they have, like UK, like America, saying they have unconditional support of Israel. $20 billion has just been approved to go across to support Israel. South Africa and many other countries have launched a case. I get it wrong. I think it's the ICJ court, the ICC. I always get those confused. But the highest courts have said there is plausible genocide here. And at the same time, Netanyahu has been classified a war criminal, just as some of the leaders from the Hamas side have been classified war criminals for their acts on October the 7th. And we're not sure what the next retaliation move is going to be. Iran has said because its sovereignty was breached in targeting some of the leadership from the axis of resistance and members from Hamas, that they need to retaliate for that. And last April, we saw what a retaliation looks like. And in the meantime, financial markets are very scared and very fearful. The VIX index, which is an index of fear, is reached its all-time high. Japan is going through some destabilization between the Bank of Japan and the Federal Reserve. We had a Black Monday stock market crash. US has been classified that it's in a recession. We got China divesting We've got the impact of sanctions on both Iran and Russia, that is creating new allies that are forming new trade with each other. And by the end of this, once we go through the whole story, you'll go through some of the different trends, oil, de-dollarization, and all those things. But let's get right back to the present, and we're going to try within 1 hour to get through some of the history that helps us understand where we are, so that we can try and understand the implications if we don't sort this out and where we go next. So how did we get to the present situation, and what is the likelihood of this being a regional war? And if it's a regional war, what's the likelihood of this becoming a world war?
That's a lot to chew, but I try to put the universe in a glass of water. It is important to understand for any investor to think what to do next is to be highly informed about the political situation. Without that, there is no point in investing, because the volatile situation, particularly in the Middle East, where the oil and gas and energy is distributed around the world, and where the source of raw material coming from Asia also is going toward Europe. All that will affect not only Europe in the first place, but also the international market. For that, there is a necessity to understand where we're going politically in the first place. Today, there are negotiations for a ceasefire that started yesterday, Thursday, in Doha, Qatar, and Israel sent a delegation to the insisting request of the Americans. And this delegation is returning, is on its way back already now. And there are information that were given to the Israeli press that the negotiation actually did not go as expected, even if there are positive image that they are trying to portray to try and de-escalate or soften the reaction of Iran and Hezbollah as a retaliation against the Israeli violation of international laws by bombing the two capitals, Beirut and Tehran. Nevertheless, we understand that Israel is the main problem here, and America is the main supporter that is not trying to solve the situation peacefully, because America is still delivering weapons to the Israelis and increasing its armament, sending ammunition, increasing the finance, adding more billions of dollars to the Israelis so they can continue the war, because without the money and the armament, nothing can happen in Israel will stop the war. Now, first of all, I would like to say that Benjamin Netanyahu is a survival, and he wants to stay in power. And for that, he is not going to accept a permanent ceasefire, because that will be the end of his political career. It means the army will go home, and he will go home or to prison, one of these two situations. Therefore, it is in his advantage, as he has managed to attract the Americans into West Asia with an enormous firepower and soldiers and allies. This is why this is his opportunity to escalate against his enemies and to keep the war ongoing. Now, that is the benefit of Benjamin Netanyahu to remain in power. But nobody else is benefiting from this situation, because Israel is in dire economic situation. The Middle East is in turmoil. The market is unstable. And the people who are going to pay the heaviest price in the first place are the people in Europe. So a regional war would undoubtedly have a significant and far-fetching impact across the economic, political, finance, social, military, and environment level. So we're talking about the heavy reliance on oil and energy that supplies the international trade route through the Middle East, through the Bab el-Mandeb, the Strait of Hormuz, the Red Sea, the Suez Canal, the Mediterranean, and we're talking about the Arab Sea that is within the reach of the missiles of Ansarullah in Yemen, and Iran in case of an all-out war. This is why it is not in the interest of the West to start a war, because the West is in need of economic stability, and the dependence on Middle Eastern energy resources and the critical role that the region plays in global trade mean that any disturbance, if we're talking about blockade or political instability, that could send a shockwaves through Western economy. And we're talking about a serious economic problem that is going to hit us in Europe, similar to the situation when the disturbance during the COVID-19 pandemic and when the global supply chain was severely affected. So we're talking about a possibility of triggering also a humanitarian crisis where there would be millions of refugees and where they would go from the Middle East to the nearby continent in Europe, which means that this is going to be a burden on the social services in all the European continent and the nearby country, and that could fuel if in political tensions and contribute to the increased rising is already there of the far-right nationalist movement that oppose the immigration, that complain about the devaluation of the local currency and the weak power of the euro. Militarily speaking, it will draw Western region because the Americans never move on their own. They want the British with them. They would drag a few European countries with them under the title of a coalition, so they don't look like they are fighting the enemy of Israel, instead of trying to establish peace and stop investing in Israeli armament. So we will see that this heavy involvement of the Europe will force the countries that are involved in the war to retaliate against European forces if these are engaged in an all-out war. And that will increase the human cost on everybody. Again, it will solicitate a retaliation and violence from people who live in Europe, who are against the war and who really don't want to see their country involved in a war only at the service of the US. So beyond the physical conflict, there is also technological, the cyber threat that can add additional danger from state or non-state actors, where the digital world will be very vulnerable and can paralyze many sectors such as energy network, train, financial system, communication system, all the technology that everything that is related to technology can be disrupted, like we've seen what happened during the Olympic Games just a few days before that in France, for example. And then there is the environment consequences, where the destructions of refinery and oil storage facilities can lead to a leak and a massive oil spills, as we have seen the Israelis doing in 2006 in the war against Lebanon. So it is not something that Israel would refrain from, and then we will have an economical catastrophe due to this war. And the most important part is the currency. Historically, investors seek always safe haven. When during a conflict, there is an attraction toward the most stable currency. We're talking, for example, about the Swiss franc. We're talking about the countries who are oil producers and they can keep exporting their energy, like Canada, so the Canadian dollar. Russia, even if there are sanctions on Russia, but still countries are buying energy, including Europe, from Russia. So the ruble will benefit because Russia is an energy producer. Saudi Arabia, the Saudi Riyal, the Norwegian krone that Norway distribute gas to Europe, is selling it 4 times more expensive, but that consolidates its currency. Therefore, we see particular countries who benefit from selling the oil that can go up to a couple of $100 per barrel in case of an all-out war, and that would be detrimental to the European and to the world economy, but also to other fragile countries like India, Turkey, Brazil, and other countries who don't have a solid economy and also rely on energy, and they have already problem with their currency. So that is the problem of an all-out war that pushed people to look at other form of payment or saving, like the cryptocurrency, and in particular Bitcoin, that is also known as a digital gold. Of course, people can argue that there is a sudden surge and decline of the cryptocurrency, but that helped people to decentralize the finance. So they look for alternative financial system to those cut off from traditional banking services, because in conflict zone, banking services can be disrupted. People have their saving that they cannot touch, they cannot borrow, or they cannot lend, and they cannot do any trading, or they cannot move their assets anywhere because maybe everything would be suspended, or there are sanctions that are imposed on several countries and other would be added to the list, or the trade could be suspended because of the lack of trust in particular countries at war during a conflict. So we have seen also China trying to compensate by adopting a digital yuan that is showing a diversifying way to keep away from the US dollar. And this is where we see, for example, Iraq selling part of its oil in Chinese currency. We have seen Saudi Arabia doing that, 30% of its oil to China in local currency, but still Saudi Arabia is adopting the dollar as a main currency to sell. Iraq, for example, has a problem because it can go to a certain limit only, because all the money of the oil goes to the American Federal Bank. And this is where the Americans are holding Iraq by the neck. And the Iraqi resistance is really not capable of contributing much in this war in supporting the Palestinian in Gaza, because there was a threat from the Americans that they will destroy the Iraqi economy and the local currency will pay the price. And it has been a demonstration for that for a couple of weeks, where there was a devaluation of the Iraqi local currency. And then the prime minister learned the lesson. And that was the time when they have agreed with the Americans to avoid hitting any American base. But in the case of an all-out war, we will not see that. There will no longer be taboos, no red lines. The American bases will be targeted, undoubtedly, depending on the intensity of the war. If the Americans will be directly involved in this war, and they will put up all their forces along the Israelis, and they will also attack Iran, for example. This is when Iran will retaliate. I mean, we're talking about the worst case scenario. And this is why we're saying that it is highly possible that this all-out war doesn't happen, because it is not in the West's best interest, even if the West is supporting Israel and continues supplying the weapons. So the disruption of vital energy supply, the global trade, the financial system, that would have profound and destabilizing effect on Western economy, is something that the West would like to avoid. So for that, all the gathering of forces in the Middle East, in my opinion, is a deterrence way to tell everybody that we are strong here, but it's better not to go to war. For Iran and for Hezbollah, this is not a question of seeing the number of the troops in the Middle East. It's a question of sovereignty. It's a question of deterrence. If they do not retaliate in one way or another, Israel will repeat the violation of international laws and will bomb again Tehran and Beirut. Now, attack on Iran happened in various phases in the past and continue to happen. The assassination of the nuclear scientist and different personalities and different security officers, but that is different. It's a guest, it's a Palestinian guest, it's a VIP guest. It is a guest that came to participate to the inauguration of the Iranian president, who extended his hand for peace to the West, and he was a guest on Iranian soil, and Israel broke all the lines, and we have a clear statement by the Iranian leaders of the revolution, Sayyid Ali Khamenei, saying to his people, to all the armed forces, prepare for attack, which means retaliate against Israel, and defense. So prepare for defending the country in case Israel retaliate. So this has no doubt that is going to happen. The timing is in the hand of the Iranians when they see fit. Today is the end of the negotiation, even if the timing was not related to the negotiations. However, I think the axis of the resistance wanted to show that they are not the one who are responsible for sabotaging these negotiations. Even if the outcome was fully positive, they will retaliate. And if the outcome is negative, it's the same. They will retaliate in any way. So the timing is important, but is in the hand of the leaders of the axis of the resistance.
Thank you so much for covering such a massive range of subjects and really bringing it to the present day and where we exactly are right now. And we've seen many of these things, you know, we've had these little trickles of experiences for anyone that's been paying attention. You know, we saw with the escalation in Ukraine and Russia, that immediately that led to an oil price negotiation between, you know, Biden trying to get Saudi Arabia to help them with oil prices and instead chose to ally with Russia. We then seen that the more that, you know, that had impact in the Western markets, that was the precursor to hiking interest rates. The hike in interest rates to try and cartel inflation led to the blowing up of Silicon Valley Bank. There is now $600 billion on banks' balance sheet at the very same time when they are trying to lower rates for election reasons, and also in response to a recession and this whole Japan-America carry trade breaking down. Japan's trying to control some of its inflation. It had to increase and things break. And that's what we can see. And now we see this little tick for tack where as NATO militarizes Ukraine more, now that's led to Ukraine in Russia. Russia responds by saying, well, Iran helped us with drones when we needed them. And so for the more that the West militarizes Ukraine, the more we're going to militarize Iran. And so we're seeing, that military escalation. And so now Iran and Russia are tied to each other, connected to each other. They're funded through their oil and gas exports. China needs their oil and gas exports. And so suddenly you're getting this whole world dividing into this global north, global south, which reminds us very similar to, pick your analogy, Cold Wars or the Allied forces, the Axis forces. And is looking closer and closer to something that could be disastrous for us all. We then know that the end game is that everybody relies on chips, whether it's fighter jets, whether it's drones, whether it's artificial intelligence, whether it's Bitcoin mining, whether it's the top companies in the world. They all need those chips that are all made in Taiwan. And if you scare China into wanting to reunify with Taiwan, you can see that the stakes are huge, and that is a catastrophe greater than the global financial crisis in terms of economic impact for us all. And so, this is what we need to avoid. And then you think it comes right back down to this, what seems like a very small thing, which is that there is, the Iran and the allied forces are saying you have to have a free Palestine. And Israel is saying Palestine will never be free. And they should put together an Abraham alliance, is what he was telling Congress. So this one thing about the Palestinian cause in the center of the world seems to be the thing that everybody needs to try and understand and focus on. And then what I'd love to ask you in the next question, and this will probably be another long answer, but I think we'll try and tackle this one because I think it's so important for people to understand. We are given two stories. One story in the West is that there's this crazy, center of terrorism called Iran, and they are surrounding anyone that wants to align with the West, whether that be Saudi Arabia, whether that be Jordan, whether that be Egypt, any country that still has the original monarchs or the kingdoms. And it's being surrounded by this revolutionary, country. And it is, trying to colonize the whole Middle East through terrorism, through Yemen, through Lebanon, through hijacking these countries. We're fed this story. And, that's the version that we need to say. And then we're being told that, these crazy, irrational terrorist attacks happen. And therefore, Israel has the right to defend. And then on the other side of the story, we're seeing the political story that you see in the United Nations. You see, right back to the British Empire, the French Empire, and the Russians designing the Middle East in a very destabilizing way because they need to access oil. These different lines are put around the ground, and you have kingdoms. And then you have forces that resist against that. You have lots of different wars every time any of those forces, are penetrated. And this long story that brings us to where Netanyahu, have Abraham Accords, where Trump says, "Screw Iran, we won't have any of those nuclear deals. We've got to fight all of these wars." Because Netanyahu feels like, and Israel feels like, another state of America as America became the power. And then you're told that, there's a story there of, you can see that Israel is colonizing. And if depending on which side you want to believe, they want to create a new vision for the Middle East, one that completely sidesteps Iran, one that sidesteps any of the allies. And at the root of the whole thing, it requires a complete ethnic cleansing of Gaza. And it can control, it requires a complete taming and elimination of any resistance against it, which on one side is called resistance, on the other side is called terrorism. So we have these two stories. And then if you look right back at politics today in countries that I love, like UK, US, you can see wealth inequality has driven people to the far left and far right, as you quite rightly pointed out. They're taking side. They're seeing, on the far left, they're seeing a humanitarian crisis. On the far right, they're seeing all of this immigration, which is making them think that they're the reason why everything's going wrong. You're getting, because both the Muslim faith and the Jewish faith seems to be being weaponized here. You've got anti-Semitism becoming a useful tool of war. You've got Islamophobia causing much division and hate and the justification for war. And you've got this divide that seems to be dividing the world and creating almost internal conflicts and what is starting to look like civil wars as more elections get rejected. So this seems to be where we are right now. And it's all coming back to this war of information and this misinformation that's being weaponized to cause so much hate amongst each other. And so what I'd love to ask, and again, that was my own tribe. What I'd love to ask is, help us understand the complexity of this word called terrorism. Like, where does it come from? How has it been weaponized? And, you know, is it exactly what it seems? Because from everything that I see, the so-called war on terror is actually often encouraged and funded from the very same countries that we're told are fighting this war on terror to destabilize regions and all sorts of stuff. So I know you're going to give a good answer here, but try and help us understand some of the history of this terror and relate that to where we are with the Israel situation and the Iran situation today.
Thank you for asking this. Actually, terrorism and counterterrorism is my studies in my master degree and my PhD. Therefore, this is a topic, one of my favorite topics. Now, it's important to understand that there is no common definition of terrorism. And the absence of a universal accepted definition of terrorism is due to many reasons: political, ideological differences, state actors who can be accused of being state terrorism, non-state actors who can be freedom fighters or accused of terrorism. So it is such a wide terminology that is mainly used only to put sanctions on people and to sanction governments because they host groups that are fighting against the interest, in this case, like the United States of America, and those who are afraid of standing against America, they need to follow and then put on their list of terrorism this group or that group or this country or that country. So there is no definition of terrorism because it's very selective. However, what is interesting is where does it come from and who has started all that? You will be surprised to know that the first terrorist group or bunch of people were called the sicari, and that comes from the word today in Italian, un sicario, which means that goes back to the Jewish sect that started in the first century under the Roman occupation in what is called today by the Israeli Judea. So we're talking about the first Jewish-Roman war and about 66, 70 CE. And the Sicari, listen to that, it's important. The Jew at that time killed and were against Roman officials, Jewish elite. So they did not hesitate to assassinate Jewish elite. And any individual that was considered as a collaborator with the Roman authority or challenging their interest and their authority. This is where the first group of terrorists started. Now, of course, throughout the years, there are many groups that were called terrorists by their countries. We're talking about the UK, we're talking about Germany, Italy, Japan. The story is long. But why I mention this is because the Jews of the first century paved the road to terrorist act and terrorist assassination. This is why today the Israelis are very good, because they have that in their gene. So if we talk about how today we are where we are, it's because in the 16th, 17th centuries, the Christian Zionists, because it started with the Christian Zionists, not with the Zionist Jews. It started with the Christian Zionists who wanted to create an environment for the tribe of the Israelite to return to the original land of Palestine. And their belief is the Messiah need to be reborn out of that land of Palestine. And for the Jews, it is not yet present, has never been present, and needs to be born. So they met on, even they don't agree on the if Jesus is going to be born or reborn, but they have agreed on the importance for the Jew to return to Palestine, but not to occupy Palestine, to return to Palestine. So what happened is that the Christian Zionists, we're talking about Lord Shaftesbury, we're talking about William Blackstone, who started to advocate for the Zionist power in the land of Palestine and the return of the Jew. And this is why they have convinced Lord Balfour to accept the Zionist. We're not talking about Jew here, talking about the Zionist movement. Anyone who reads the 1917 Balfour Declaration, it is writing about specifically the Zionist movement. He's not talking about the religion of Judaism. So he's saying the Zionist movement can return to Palestine to live in harmony with the local population, because there were already 27,000 Jews in Palestine living with the Christian and Muslim Palestinians, and they were all Palestinians. So after the Balfour Declaration, in support with the Protestant Christian and the Evangelical Christian, who supported the exodus of the gathering of all the Jews to go to Palestine. Now, listen to that, is very important, because Theodor Herzl was an atheist, and you cannot say that the Jews are returning to Palestine because they are the chosen people of God they do believe in. Because Herzl was an atheist, and the Zionist movement was not religious. So how you contradict yourself? This is where the biggest contradiction started and emerged. So the Zionist movement landed in Palestine because of the British divide and conquer, because they were concerned about the formation of an Arab unity with the wealth and the natural resources that exist in the Middle East. And they needed someone, a mercenary group, or someone to divide them. And this is why Israel started to become the hub and the center of attention, and the place where the West will supply with arms, with technology, with a nuclear reactor by the French, the first people who supplied Israel, to make Israel strong in the middle of the Middle East that is in control of the energy. And this is why today the Middle East cannot give up on the dollar, because that will be the end of the United States. And this is why they need a bully in the Middle East that is always present. So it is not against the Jews versus Christian and Muslim, because when we talk about the Palestinians, we're not talking about the Muslims. We're talking about the Muslims and the Christians, because this is the land that hosts the religion of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. And both Christianity and Islam believe in Judaism. It is part of their religion and part of their ideology. This is why it is a high level of ignorance when people consider any criticism of Israel, the atheist, as anti-Semite by the people who are by the Semite who are in the Middle East, when most of the people in Israel are not Semite. So this rhetoric that the Israeli very cleverly managed to establish, any criticism of Israel is anti-Semitic, therefore is condemned and punished by the law in the West, because they are the holder of a very weak case, and they need to defend themselves by imposing unlawful laws that contradict with the constitution of our countries. This is where everything has started. And the Israelis, before they became part of the nation called Israel, they landed as refugees. They came from all different places around the world, when Golda Meir, the Prime Minister of Israel, showed her Palestinian passport. That was Palestine. It was called Philistine. It is the ancient country where the people, the Canaanite, lived, and they were before the arrival of Abraham, before the arrival of Moses, who brought the religion of Judaism. But they are most welcome because all religions live together in harmony in the same piece of land. Now, if we see why we are where we are today, it's because the Israelis looked at the situation where they are. It is not convenient for them to be in control of a small piece of land when the Palestinians control a smaller piece, but a bigger land in their name. And because the Israelis have the power, they have the jets, they have the control of the air, the sea, the land over the Palestinians, there is nothing that prevents them from controlling all of Palestine, at the exception of the Palestinian people who refused to leave their land. So what happened is, in 1948, with the creation of the state of Israel, those who created this state again are come from the same generation of the Sikari, because we're talking about the groups who immediately as they have landed, they formed the Haganah group, who start killing British soldiers, and then the Lehi, that group in disagreement with the Haganah because they thought it is not enough. We need to kill Arab and Jews, not only, and when we say Arab, it's Christian and Muslim. And then we have people like Ishaq Shamir, who was part of the gang that was the extremist among the Zionists. Not talking about Jew, we're talking about the Zionists here. And he killed even Jews, like his ancestors who killed the Roman and Jews in Palestine. And they were the first who started to kill the Roman and the Jews. And Shamir was the first who reintroduced the killing of the Jews by Jews in Palestine. And if we see Ishaq Shamir, who came after Golda Meir, and Golda Meir after David Ben-Gurion, they all were part of the same gangs who murdered the Palestinians. And Benjamin Netanyahu, the prime minister of today, was the disciple of Ishaq Shamir. He worked in his office. He learned by the terrorist, because Ishaq Shamir was considered by the British as a terrorist. You can Google it. And he learned from him how to terrorize the Palestinian Christian and Jews, and Christian and Muslim and Jews. Because, why I say Jews, is because the Jews today, the Orthodox, who are studying Judaism, who have their schools, threatened Benjamin Netanyahu that they would leave Israel because they don't need a nation in case he forces the army enrollment upon them. And when we have those who carry Judaism teaching and ideology saying there's nothing that links us to this land, and we came here only to expand Judaism, which is their right, but it is also telling a lot that those who hold the religion do not have any link to the land that belongs to the Palestinians, but not to the Zionists, because the Zionists are not religion in majority. This is where there is a confusion today between the Zionists who are in the United States or in Europe, who understand very little about Zionism, because one of the Zionism is the Aliyah, to return to the land, and they still in Europe and in the United States, in the Americas, everywhere around the world, but not returning. And they speak about part of Zionism is also democracy, and Zionism is not implementing democracy. The Likud party today says, since 1977, that the presence of every Palestinian on the land of Israel is a danger to the Israeli state. Therefore, Benjamin Netanyahu is sincere about saying no to the Palestinian state, no to any Palestinian on the land of Palestine that he calls Israel. That is the core of the problem, because in 1993, when the Americans supervised the Oslo Agreement with the Palestinians and Ishaq Rabin, at that time the prime minister, they agreed that the 1993 Oslo 1 and 1993 Oslo 2 will lead to a Palestinian state in 1999. Benjamin Netanyahu encouraged the Israeli to kill their prime minister. This is why I told you about the beginning of the Jews during the Roman Empire in the first century, killing not only Roman but Jews, and then Ishaq Shamir killing Jews in Palestine, and then Benjamin Netanyahu pushing an Israeli to kill his prime minister, Ishaq Rabin, who signed the deal, the Oslo Agreement, to give the Palestinian a state. And what Benjamin Netanyahu did today, when Joe Biden is talking about the two-state solutions, is he went to the parliament, that is the Knesset, and obtained that no Palestinian state is allowed on the land of Israel. So this is the end. So he closed the doors. So where we are at today, we are at in front of a fact that the Israeli army is incapable of occupying Gaza and staying in Gaza. The Israelis discovered that their army is not capable of exterminating of all the Palestinians, the 7.5 million, even if they would like to do so, because this is what the Israelis are telling us. They starve them, they cut electricity, water, medical supply, food, they sodomize them, they allow them to die in prison, they torture them, they close the road, they revoke their permit to go outside and work, they treat them like animals. This is what Yoav Gallant, the defense minister, told us, how he is considering the Palestinians as animals, and they have no value to any child, because they consider the child is going to grow and fight them, or any women, that they consider all women should be killed because they would give birth one day in the future, because they know the future, and is going to give birth to a child that's going to fight them. The Palestinians on their side will never return to the situation before the 7th of October. It is over. They are dealing now with all cards on the table. The Israelis don't want to give them a state. The Palestinians will never live in humiliation, and they will continue fighting. And if there is a ceasefire tomorrow, the Palestinians will come out and will say, we agree on the ceasefire, but we will continue fight because we want our state back. This is where we are at today.
And the last 10 months, I can't tell you, I've had to sit and watch from the comfort of my home. And it's changed me as a human, experiencing just the videos that have been shared, and the people that I've met people over the last 10 months who I met online, and their children are all gone. Their grandparents are gone. They're it's been the most almost desensitizing the human spirit inside of me, having to see and experience what is happening to civilians. And every morning I wake up saying we I feel like we have one job in the world, and that's at least to protect our children. And every day I wake up to a new travesty, like atrocity of what we're doing as humans, and just wondering how the hell we got here. And that's why I'm just so committed to understanding this, because from my perspective, it's impossible to even figure out a path to peace if you don't really understand the problem. And the problem that we've been fed is always from the version of events from whoever wins the war, whoever controls the media. And whenever you follow the money and you dig deeper, you find an absolute web of deceit, and you find complete atrocities and propaganda. And the only way we can ever get to this peace, and from my perspective, my understanding is that, you need some kind of normalization between Saudi Arabia and Iran, two different ideologies, two different allies with, you need a Palestinian state. And then you need less troops in the Middle East. But we know that really the economic reality here is that there is a massive industry that benefits from war. There is a massive amount of protectionism that's required in order to keep the dollar as its dominant power right now. And there is all sorts of deep state operations and regime changes and destabilizations that happen all around the world, where we're told this is what's happening. And it turns out that, this is complete protection of interests. That if we really understood what our government, the acts that our governments and our intelligence agencies were actually engaging in, it's so far from any of our, forget about just religious beliefs. It's anti-Christian, it's anti-Muslim, it's anti-Judaism, it's anti-Hinduism, but it's anti-spiritual, it's anti-human, it's anti... if we truly understood the acts that our governments, and that's what the last 10 months have been for me, just experiencing the human catastrophe of this obfuscation of understanding what's happened with our money, the political side of it, and the implications, and then that coming round and the financial side and everything. So it's just so much to take in. And that's why I try and bring guests that my audience wouldn't typically have heard, because there's a financial side and there's a humanitarian side. We can destroy everything that we've built by not getting the humanitarian side right. There's a theological side here. There's a media control side here. And there's so much to unpack in everything that's happened here. So I just wanted to, we're just covering the tip of the surface here. From your experience, Elijah, of actually being in these war zones and experiencing the catastrophes that you've had to experience, could you help us understand around, in the West, we're told that there's these terrorist groups that are out to get us, and they want to take away our freedom and democracy. And we're told that, immediately when October the 7th happened, we were told that a resistance against these atrocities that did lead to war crimes and acts that none of us can imagine. I'm just resentful that our role as Westerners in getting humans to this point where they can even the only choice that they felt they could engage in is these types of acts. That only comes from being involved in a war zone that you felt was unjust, seeing your parents and children being killed in a war, thinking that there's nothing else to do but resist against it, being brought up in a narrative that really changes your perspective of what it's like to be a human, and then being told that when all of your resources are being raped, pillaged, and all sorts of atrocities are happening, that you're just this crazy terrorist that is irrationally engaging in these things, and therefore we need to kill them all. And then you find out that these radical groups are actually being used by agencies like the CIA, like Mossad, like MI5, and they're being weaponized. And when you look at all these different groups and you follow the money, you find out that Al-Qaeda was weaponized and funded by America. And these different groups like ISIS, they're actually encouraged in order to achieve political gains so that you can connect the acts of these horrific acts to 2 billion Muslim people and make that connection in people's brain that these acts that are being encouraged by intelligence agencies are actually the reason why you need to hate these people. So just try and help us understand some of the wars, Iraq war, Afghan war, some of the regions that have been destabilized, Sudan, and the role of intelligence agencies and the West in creating these things and creating this thing that we're meant to be waging a war on. And in fact, it is two-way terror, but one side of terror gets to use statehood and media to control to say that this is okay as defense. And the other gets painted in such a different light. And it's just mass manipulation and psyops that are designed to justify atrocious acts. Try and unpack some of that, Elijah.
Yeah. So everything comes down to one word: double standards. It is our specialty. Because anything that Israel does or the Americans are doing, it is considered as a self-defense. And anything outside the Western club is considered terrorism. I'm going to give you infinite examples, but I'm going to just try to give only a few. For example, the US Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, was criticizing Russia for occupying part of Ukraine. And he was saying no country has the right to occupy any piece of land from another country. And the same journalist of the CNN asked him, what about the Syrian occupied Golan Heights by the Israelis? Because the Israelis occupy the Syrian Golan Heights, and then Donald Trump gave a gift, a land that doesn't belong to him. And he said, oh, that's different because it's important for the security of Israel. Already anything that comes out of the US administration of who is right or wrong, where is terrorism and who is a terrorist and who is not a terrorist, is no longer taken into consideration because international laws are not applicable on everybody by the standard of this man who represents the foreign policy of the US administration. We go to the Ansarullah Houthis. The Americans said, stop attacking the Israeli shipment and we will lift you off the terrorist list and the sanction list, which means that from one day to another, the Americans can consider, oh, we are okay with Ansarullah. They no longer consider terrorists if they allow the Israeli ships. But where is the principle of definition of terrorism? On what are you basing your accusation to lift the sanction, to lift Ansarullah? I am with lifting Ansarullah, by the way, but I'm saying the concept of terrorism, accusing a group of being a terrorist when you are capable of lifting this group from a list from one day to another. The PKK branch in Syria. The PKK Kurd branch in Syria were always considered by the West as a terrorist group. And they are the one defending the American occupation forces in the northeast of Syria. Where is the balance here? When Rex Tillerson, the US Secretary of State, reached office and he's confronted with a memo that people can find on Politico, 2018, saying we consider a violation of human rights only the acts done by the enemy of the United States. And we're talking here about Iran, China, Russia, and Korea, but not the friends of the United States. So any definition that comes from the United States is baseless. Why, if the PLO before 1990 attack an Israeli target, that's an act of terrorism, and why the Israeli target assassination is under the title of Israel has a right to defend itself. So let us put all the opinion on the side and go to the international laws. According to the United Nations, the Palestinians are the resistance and the Israelis are considered as an occupation forces. Therefore, they have no right to defend themselves. It is up to the resistance to defend itself and to attack the enemy. The way they attack, if it is compatible or not with the Geneva Convention, with the UN resolution, with the UN law, with the international laws, that's another subject. But it is static that Israel is an occupation forces, and then the Palestinians are the resistance. So we cannot be cherry picking when we say, oh, now we talked to Arafat because he accepted to sign a deal with Israel, and then we forget about everything. And then the Israelis will be in harmony with Yasser Arafat. But the day he refused to be in harmony with the Israelis because the Israelis and the Americans lie and did not give a state to the Palestinians, then he becomes a terrorist. So you see this double standard that is always manifested in everything the Americans are doing. But the Israelis are minor criminal in front of the Americans because the Israelis are killing a Palestinian people. But the Americans went to Afghanistan and killed hundreds of thousands. They went to Iraq and killed hundreds of thousands. They went to Syria. They tried to create a failed state. They went to Libya and destroyed Libya. So all these are the real criminals. And we're not talking about Vietnam. We're not talking about all the coup d'etat that America is responsible of. So how we can say that this nation is the distributor of the good conduct on the people and on organization or states, who is terrorist, who is not terrorist, when they have committed the most terrorist acts in history. So going to Afghanistan after 20 years to defeat Taliban, they gave back the power to the Taliban. Going to Iraq, they've destroyed Iraq. I went to Iraq since 2003, and I saw how the Americans behave in Iraq. They did everything in their power to control the country. And what they did is they were faced with a harsh resistance, Sunni and Shia, who stood against them. Abu Mus'ab al-Zarqawi, the one who was the leader of the Al-Qaeda franchise in Iraq, was living in Kurdistan, in the area where the Americans were in control before 2003. And he was no one before the Americans boosted his image. And then we have the occupation of Iraq for all this time under false pretext of weapons of mass destruction. We have Tony Blair, the prime minister, coming out and say, mea culpa, I'm sorry. Oh, by the way, we killed 1 million Iraqis and we made a mistake. We did not find any weapons of mass destruction, but we get away with it because we said we are sorry. And what about the hundreds of thousands of families, Iraqis, Sunni and Shia, who were killed in Iraq because of the presence of the occupation forces? Nobody speaks about them because the Americans are the good guys, because we are on the right side of the strong party. We're not weak. We have weapons. We have military bases everywhere in the world. We are part of the same club. So we have the luxury to do whatever we want. We don't have any accountability. This is exactly what Israel is doing today. But I would like to say something very recent. Israel said it has defeated Hamas in Gaza, and there were only 4 battalions remaining out of 24. And after 10 months of devastating war, of imposing the dirty diplomacy by killing daily from 500 Palestinian civilians to between 30 to 100 per day, that is the way to break the will of the Palestinians. What is happening is the CNN said out of 24 battalions, Hamas managed to reconstruct 22 battalions. Where these come from? They come from the people who are enrolling with Hamas, with the other, because there are 5 or 6 Palestinian groups, not only Hamas. So with the Palestinian resistance, people are joining the Palestinian resistance. And it shows that the killing of the Palestinian civilians is giving more resolve to the Palestinian people to go and join the resistance because they have nothing to lose. The Israelis killed their families. They've killed and wounded more than 220,000 Palestinians in 10 months. They've destroyed the infrastructure. They've destroyed the home of the Palestinians. They've changed the geography of Gaza Strip. And yet the Palestinians are still surviving. And they still saying, we will not leave this land. The Americans built a pier in Gaza to allow an exodus for the Palestinians to be transported somewhere else. This is the plan of Benjamin Netanyahu, his finance minister, Bezalel Smotrich, and his security minister, Itamar Ben-Gvir. Why this pier was dismantled, despite the fact that the Americans said it costed $320 million, which is a joke, by the way. But that's not the topic. So why it was dismantled? Because the Palestinians will not leave. On the contrary, they go and enroll with the Palestinian resistance to continue fighting against the Israelis, who have the upper hand with their jets, with their artillery, with their tanks, and they keep fighting. They are manufacturing weapons inside Gaza. They're using the unexploded bombs to send them back against the Israeli settlements. Why? Because there is a will and a power to resist the occupier. Because they are defined by the United Nations as resistance group. And those who are attacking Gaza are defined as the occupation forces, the immoral occupation forces, because they don't abide by any rule. The International Court of Justice, as you rightly said, the ICJ, ordered the Israelis to stop the war and to restore peace in Gaza. As occupation forces, they have duty to contribute to the people they are occupying. And the Israelis consider them animals. They don't want to abide by any duty. The ICC, the International Criminal Court, consider Benjamin Netanyahu as war criminal with his defense minister Yoav Gallant. And what's happening? The West, we here, those who are holding the high moral ground, and then we talk about international law, we supply Benjamin Netanyahu with weapons to kill more Palestinians. We give him more money to finance his war. And then we pretend that we want peace. We can't drop food and bombs at the same time on the Palestinians. That's hypocrisy. But do we really want to see the end of this war? This is a wish that the Americans are expressing, but the act that the Americans are doing is incompatible with the situation today when they supply the Israelis with all the bombs they need, sufficient enough that if they want to continue the war and wage war on Iran, Yemen, and Lebanon by acknowledging the selling of the F-15 Eagle jets that can go until Yemen and Iran and bomb it, that means we are encouraging Israel to continue the war, but not to stop the war. And this is why Benjamin Netanyahu is clever enough to understand the weakness of this US administration and then continue his survival plan by killing as many Palestinians as he wants and by defying the United States, taking its money, its weapons, and continue the war until the end of his mandate in October 2026.
Very well put. And I think we could talk for many, many more hours just into all the topics that come up from this. And we will continue to do those. For anyone that doesn't follow Elijah, he's very active on X. I subscribe to his, when you follow him, you have the option of paying to subscribe. I do that because I want to support his work. I have found him to be a very calming force throughout all of the highs and lows of everything that we've been through over the last 10 months of experiencing this. I want Elijah to continue. So if anyone likes this, supporting Elijah, I encourage you to do that. And he regularly posts articles that really help you understand what's coming next, and is always open to debate as well, and very generous in his time on X Spaces to support people. You'll often find me on stage with Elijah, so I encourage you all to do that and support his work. And I want to leave with one topic, really, and in the end, it all comes down to the power that is exerted by being able to have the Federal Reserve print dollars and people consume those bonds. And last week I had an interview where we went through how war is actually funded and how people pay through inflation, and the whole monetary flow, and how it's exported these financial weapons of mass destruction through the International Monetary Fund. And you always see this dollar debt being weaponized against countries. And you've seen it in Lebanon, you've seen it in Egypt, you've seen it time and time again, countless examples of how the dollar can be weaponized in order to destabilize a region, get regions addicted to debt, and then they end up destroying their own currencies to try and support their regions. And this happens time and time again. And that seems to me how all of these different allies have been formed. And one could call that terrorism. It's financial terrorism. It's inflicted by banksters, and it is the primary source of funding, terrorism financing. And we all pay for it with excessive inflation and in the debt cycle. So it's systemic. But this resistance movement did come in 2008, and that was Bitcoin, which gave people ability to peacefully exit and have a monetary policy you can rely upon, which is why I've ever since discovering it in 2011, I've been so passionate about helping people understand that there is a peaceful resistance, and you can say no, and you can opt out, and that is something. And at the same time, unfortunately, you cannot go around and abuse power without creating an equal counterforce. And so in October, there is a BRICS currency, which is going to be some kind of cryptocurrency, and allow for different regions and different areas and members of BRICS: Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, more recently joined by Iran, and Ethiopia, and I think there's probably up to 100 applications. At one stage they said 40, but there's a conference in October. And to me, this should not be thought of as we need to defend America. It should be thought of making the dollar a more peaceful currency, because I believe in competition, and I believe absolute power corrupts absolutely. And the British Empire was, a very violent force, weaponizing its naval fleet in order to pillage the world of its gold and silver. And then there was another force that came, which is America, that created a new flavor through its foreign policy, and through different allies and regions. And we are seeing that this is becoming a changing time and a changing moment in history. And so there is a movement for de-dollarization, and I believe that de-dollarization makes a more peaceful and better dollar. I think we should all encourage competition. Personally, I believe that everyone needs to think about their own protectionism, of course. But if we can get back to, the world's largest producer and the world's largest consumer, China and America, figuring out how to get to a more peaceful relationship, and we can figure out how to take away and defund much of the forces that are just taking us in a really wrong direction, and just understand the monetary flows and have more competition in currency. Because it seems to me that this whole thing is about protecting the petrodollar, and BRICS seems to be a resistance movement against that. And Bitcoin is giving an alternative for people to opt out. And now we have X spaces where we can all talk with each other and realize, rather than dehumanizing each other, rehumanize each other. Recognize that our governments are taking acts that are made completely out of whack with our values. And our religions are being weaponized in order to make us think that we need to hate each other. When really, peace, these religions are meant to bring us closer to God, closer to each other, closer to humanity. They're all connected as well. But we're being told that this is something completely different to what it is. So I'd love to end with a message of, what this by using currencies and having more competition, what type of forces are happening there? Is de-dollarization significant? Is the petrodollar under attack? And can we enter to what needs to happen for us to get to a more peaceful place, and just recognize that there is a resistance movement against that, and how do we get to a better place without completely destroying everything we built? I'd love to leave you with that final answer, Elijah. How can we get to a more peaceful place?
Unfortunately, it's not going to happen very soon. You see, America became an empire when America kicked out the Spaniard at the end of the 1890s. And then it has introduced the Federal Bank in 1913. And then we have the Second World War, when the Americans started to impose their power upon other continents, including Europe, because of the Marshall Plan, because of the support of the Americans in the Second World War, because Europe was bankrupt and it needed to be reconstructed. But we pay all our debts until 2016 back to the Americans. So every penny the Americans took back. And then we had the collapse of the Soviet Union. And with the collapse of the Soviet Union, America remained the only hegemony in the world. But it took its real power from the petrodollar. And because the dollar became the currency to sell and buy oil, this is why the Americans started to print dollar without any oil coverage. And this is when the Americans had the luxury, with paper, with the cost of the paper and the ink, to have more than 750 military bases around the world. Now, these are not going to fall from one day to another. But the process has started thanks to the American thinking that they can break and loot Russia and divide it into different states and then steal all its natural resources. That was the plan that the Americans offer in Brussels to the European leaders at the beginning of the war between Ukraine and Russia, but this is between the West and Russia. And they said there is too much wealth in Russia to be under the control of one country. This is not fair. In Europe, we don't have natural resources. We have the industry, we have the savoir-faire, but we don't have the energy. We need energy, apart from a little bit in the UK and a bit in Norway, where they have gas, but Europe need energy. And then this didn't work well. Because the plan failed, regardless what's happening now in Kursk and the incursion of the Ukrainians into Russian territory to divert the attention a bit, but they will end up being killed if they don't pull out. But that's just a distraction. At the end of the day, BRICS is organizing itself without being anti-American, but to avoid being sanctioned by the Americans whenever the Americans want, and whenever the Americans are unhappy with the policy of a country. Then they impose sanctions to cripple the economy. But in fact, they're not imposing sanctions on the government. They're imposing sanctions on the people so the people can turn against their government and they can have a clean color revolution to create a coup d'etat by the same people without being involved directly in sending troops or killing, target assassination or nothing. No, they just turn the people against their ruler. And then this is what they have succeeded, which they've done in so many places. And the last was in Iraq against Prime Minister Adil Abdel Mahdi after the 2014 Maidan in Ukraine. So because of that, because of the petrodollar, the United States can maintain all these bases around the world. The day the Saudis, the Emiratis, the Kuwaitis decide, the Iranians, the Russians decide to sell in their local currency, that will be the end of the dollar. But then, on the other hand, it will be the end of a few regimes, because wherever there is no democracy, the Americans can say, hey, you are a dictatorship here. We need to turn it into democracy, or you keep using the dollar. And then, as Donald Trump said, we are happy with dictators. And he likes dictators. But this is not Donald Trump as a person. It is as the US administration who is happy with anyone who fits with its own policy. Therefore, as long as this continues and regimes or kingdoms are afraid to be overthrown or to face a coup d'etat, and then have another person who is ready to sell again the oil using only the dollar, then we're not going to have that until people free themselves. But the process has started. And we see how the Iranians, the Russians, and the Chinese are already dealing with their own currency. China has established many systems with credit cards, with a bank transfer, with the crypto yuan for the countries under sanction to use and bypass the US sanctions. And then we have other countries who are not willing to be outside this new global economic hegemony that is forming itself, maintaining good relationship with the US, but finding alternatives. And this is what it has been built, and this is the future of the BRICS. And this needs some time. It's not going to happen from one day and then to another to dethrone the US that has been sitting on the throne of the world since 1945. But it's going to happen, but it's going to be a slow process.
Yeah, and a slow transition is always good rather than a violent and sudden one. So I do believe that competition in currency is one of the most important things, and technology is driving a lot of that competition in currency, and the ability for us to maintain our freedom of speech. And I want people to understand, as we come to a close now, that I believe there is evil from governments all around the world. You know, there are things that every country should have its own struggle against its government to try and make its government do better things. But coming in and toppling a government, someone else's government, that's justified through things like their culture is so different to us, they're doing human rights violations, they don't do things the way we do. We could do things better, has always led to a lot worse. Whatever you think of Saddam Hussein, they replaced him with ISIS. That's not an improvement. And a region that's split into three, and an economy that is just so destructive for those that are just the ordinary people. So regime change does not have a good track record. And what I would encourage everyone to do is look at all the actions that are happening today. I cover them every week to try and help people understand some of the flows and the finance side. But just look in Venezuela, look in Bangladesh, look in Pakistan, just look at the patterns that happen time and time again. It starts with sanctions, it leads to excessive debt, and then suddenly there is a complete regime change, and that new regime tends to be more favorable to the very same force that was funding the very same things that they were calling terrorism in order to try and get the regime change. And it never leads to the country having a better result. It almost always leads to it being occupied, or its resources being pillaged, or it being destabilized for a very deliberate reason, because it wants that country to be destabilized. And we're all paying for it. It all comes from the central banks that are printing the money. And it's the exact same force that is creating cost of living crises for us in the West, where we can no longer, the vast majority of the population can no longer afford to just be a family and live rent. And it's all connected. And then we all start blaming immigration with all these crises. And even that, illegal immigration is a way of manipulating inflation to make the numbers look better, so that you don't know that your wealth is being confiscated. And in the end, this parasite called central banks ends up with the largest wealth inequality. And wealth inequality drives you further to the left if you feel you're shafted from the system, further to the right if you benefited from the system and becoming part of lobby groups where you use your power in order to change laws to get the system in your favor. And eventually that leads to a level of resentment where your country looks like the UK looks right now and America looks right now, where if the right politician does not get elected next, the whole system can live into civil unrest, civil wars, revolutions. And then eventually an external force comes along and says, this country is weak. Let's change it all. And you get all these different wars and these different forces. Somehow we need to break that cycle and we need to understand it. And personally, I just believe more information is the key, and recognizing that we've all been tricked and we've all been scammed to think completely different to the reality. And it's up to us to fix it. And technology gives us the opportunity to do that. And so, Elijah, having got to know you over the last 10 months, I can't wait to continue experiencing this with you. And thank you so much for coming on our show. And I'm sure many people will see things differently. They may disagree with some of these things, but have it be known that this comes from understanding somebody that's been on the ground, understands it, and seen the humanitarian catastrophe that comes from it. And we all need to fix this together. So thank you for joining us. And I'd love to have you back. There's so many different topics in this. And so, yeah, I just want to say thank you, Elijah, and we'll see you on the next show.
Thank you, Simon. With great pleasure. I enjoy being with you.
Thank you.